So the homework from the previous video was to make a validation for our login form, and some of you made a very interesting solutions. So let me do my version of a solution, and also let's see how the open closed principle works in object-oriented programming, what it is, and how it can benefit us in one applicable example. And do not worry if you didn't solve the problem at all, or if it's different than what I'm going to present here. There are many solutions and there is no one single correct solution in programming. You decide what you make and what works for your application. You can always improve it, come back to it and refactor it. So the homework was to validate these fields from the post before sending them to the database. It might not be that relevant in this example because the database will just return false if the input is incorrect. However, we sometimes get some tasks that we don't like or don't find logical. And this login is basically what is after this login form here, where we can log into our administration panel. Now I'm just dumping bad login, but we need to validate if the password is long enough, and we need to display a message to the users. So let's start in an object-oriented fashion, and let's make one class called validation.php, named validation. And we'll have one public function named validate password, because that's what we are working with. So the parameter will be password. And here we had several requirements. One was to have the minimum number of characters, then the maximum, and also one special character. And for that, we can just count the length of the string. So we can say that if of the password is shorter than we said three characters, I believe, we're going to return false. We do the similar thing for the maximum, that the parameter should not be longer than 20. And to check if there is a special character in our method, we will do what every good programmer does, and that is copy paste. So I will just steal this code from Ozan, I hope that I'm pronouncing correctly, who sent his homework via YouTube comments. And here he is using pragmatch to check if the password is containing one special character, or rather if it's not containing, and we'll just do the if around it. So if it does not contain one special character, we are just going to return false, otherwise we are returning true. And one tip here is to avoid nesting ifs. This way we can just copy or remove this part, or we can just comment entire part, and the function will continue working, rather than having the if true, then go into this if, and then go into this if, etc, etc. We try to avoid nesting ifs and any code, as a matter of fact, like this, so that we can have a better control of it. And now we can actually use this validation as soon as I import it inside of our index module, index.php, sorry. And I'll just put one to-do here to move these imports to a standalone function, and we will cover that in one future video. Auto include. Now, since we have validation available throughout our application, we can just check it here. And here we can say that validation equals to new validation, right? And we can just check that if validation validate password, or rather if not validate, we can for now just store it in a session as one validation rules variable. Let's put one more level called error. And the error is password must be between 3 and 20 characters and must contain one special character. Now this session variable is something that we're going to show inside of our login HTML. And we can put it right here under the password in one div, for example, with a class. Since we are using Bootstrap, we can say text danger, for example. So we are just going to echo this variable, and if it's null, then we are just going to put an empty string. And now if we try our luck with the login, we get the password must be between 3 and 20 characters, but we also get some undefined property in validation, let's 17. Let's see what that is. It is this password. That's the copy paste programming right there. Let's remove this dump on the dashboard controller line 44. So now if the password is invalid, we get the message that the password must be formatted properly. And that works, and that's basically a finished homework. However, now we need to validate the username as well. So we can make another method called the validate username, right? Inside of our validation class. and it will accept username, and it will check the similar things both for minimum and maximum. However, we are now switching from the regular username to the email because here it says email and somebody decided that it should be email. So for that we can just check on the filter var from the PHP. So if we just Google for PHP validate email, we basically get the php.net official recommended method using the filter variable. So if we just do it like this, we can just check if it is not an email, we are going to return false. Otherwise, we are going to return true. And here we are going to check on the username as well. Let's quickly do that. Validate username. And for the error, we can just say that the username is not valid email. If we now test our code, if we write admin, we basically get the username is not a valid email. However, again, copy paste from the validation. This should be username, not a password. And we still get the username is not valid. That is because we are not writing email. If we write email, and we get that the password is now not valid. So it works. Everything is fine. The homework is finished. You noticed, of course, that there is a copy of the code. All these validation rules are duplicated here. These are pretty simple, but if we would to change them to validate a bit better or using some different methods, we would have to go around and duplicate and fix things around. And as mentioned, duplication is our enemy. So what we can do now is we can extract this to a separate method and this one as well as a separate method. And each of those individual as a separate methods here in the validation class. And then we will have them a bit isolated. However, we are still using functions in a class, basically. There is not much of object-oriented advantages here, not at all, basically. And it's not a bad thing to use the functions, but in this tutorial we are talking about objects, right? So let's see how we can make this object-oriented. And one and relatively easy way to do that is that we could make an object for each individual rule. So then the rules objects themselves can do the validation. And that way we can then clean a bit this validate password method and also make it easier to reuse our validation classes. So let's make one folder with rules inside the source, for example, called validation rules. And here we are going to make several PHP classes like validate minimum, which is then going to have one method named validate rule. And the parameter will be the value that we want to validate against. So we can just get this if else from here. However, this number 3 is now hard-coded and we don't want to hard-code things. We can make this a private property named minimum that we are going to set or inject via a constructor. So the moment we are initializing this rule, we can then set the minimum value correctly. And that way we can use this local variable to validate this rule against. And let's copy this rule and make it a validate maximum, right? Let me rename the minimum to maximum and preserve case. And here it should be greater than. Then I will quickly do the same for the validate email. And email does not need any constructions. It will just check if the filter variable is correct. Otherwise, it is going to return true. And the last rule that I will quickly make is the validation of the special character. And for that, we are going to use this prag match. And we can also pass this prag match during the construction. So this will be the rule, but we can set it to default in case we don't want to pass it each and every time. And I need this return true for all other rules here. And now what is left is that we can just reuse those special objects inside our validation class. But let's just import them here because we want them globally accessible. So this will be validation rules folder, validate minimum, maximum, email, and special character. So let me just comment this entire portion here and let's make it so that it's object oriented, right? So we need the validation minimum on 3 characters. And then we're just going to ask that object to do the validation for us. So if not validation minimum, validate rule of our password, we are going to return false. And then I will do the same for the maximum as well. And yes, you guessed it, the validation of special character will be done the similar way. And I hope that you are wondering how is this method any better. And I will show you Why am I doing it this way? So let's make validation for special character. I need to fix the name here. Now our code should work. So if I type the wrong password, we get the password must be correct. However, in the validate minimum, there is a typo. Let's fix that one. So this should be the value. The same for maximum. And we can see that validation is actually working. Now, this way of doing it is a bit cleaner and a bit more extendable because we can reuse this rule. We can use the same validation rule for our validation of email here or validation of username. And that way we can contain this validation itself inside of its own object so that here we know how to compare the minimum and maximum, of course, because we have this logic in only single place, right? And when we get more rules and more complex logics, then it gets much more easier to do that on one single place, like this, for example, special character that we had. If we decide to go the other way, because pragmatch is not serving us well, we can go to some other functions or some other method of validating if there is a special character to it. And I sincerely hope that you are still not convinced that this is much better way, because again, we have the similar amount of code here as we have here. As a matter of fact, we have much more code because we have now 4 additional objects than we had when we started. So you can argue that there is even more duplication of the code. So how can this code actually be better than the previous one? Well, you would be actually right. This code is not efficient. It is not using proper object-oriented principles. And this is some of the traps that I talked about when the object-oriented principles are not correctly or properly applied. And we can get in the big mess when we need to extend this code because it's not very optimal. For example, if we would add a rule to validate the IP address or perhaps mobile phone or landline, zip code, address format, etc., etc., there are hundreds of different things that we want to validate. And by using the solution like this, not completely optimized, we are not that far away from using plain functions. Actually, a good written code that uses only functions is actually much better than writing a bad oriented code. And this is why object-oriented coding is a bit difficult. It's not just about knowing how to make classes and methods, it's about knowing a bit more complex principles. So the main issue here with this code is that it breaks the second of 5 solid principles that are used in object-oriented programming, the open closed principles that I mentioned at the beginning. And let's see what the solid principles are, and specifically let's discuss this open closed principle here. So the solid is an acronym of 5 principles: the single responsibility principle, the open closed, list code substitution, interface segregation, and dependency inversion. We mentioned the single responsibility in the previous videos when we talked about singletons. It means that one entity, the class or a method or function, should have one and only responsibility. It should be very clear what the intention and the purpose of it is. In this video, we will focus on the second, the letter O for the open-closed principle, which says that the class should be open for extension and closed for modification. Which doesn't mean anything without an applicable example, but in essence it means that when a similar requirements are expected for a class in our example, the class should be able to do those new things, new similar things, without us needing to actually change the class. Like in our case where we will most likely get some new requirements that are different, like a minimum or maximum required, or an IP code validation or zip code, or something even more specific for different projects, like a CMS page slug or whatever. So instead of us just shoving new functionality inside our class each time we need something that is similar but in a way different, our class should be able to do different ways of validation with many different rules without us having to each time open that code, open that class and change the code and write a new functionality and then worrying if we would break something because there are so many things that are interconnected in our code. So we should write it in such a way that it has some interface where different behaviors could just plug into our class, and that way our class is sort of like extendable. That way we don't need to even change our code for our class. Our entities should have some way of connecting different functionality to it, like in our case with validation, but this also applies to, for example, the shipping class. Sometimes we might use the DHL as a shipping provider, other times we might do the UPS. And each of those, let's call them plugins, work in a completely different way. They are contacting different endpoints. they're having different prices. So our class should not care about what endpoint it uses, what plugin it uses, as long as it's compatible. It actually extends our class to do a bit more things that we can initially think of it. So if we think about this principle as a way of having some sort of plugins that extend our functionality, like our IDE, for example, majority of editors and IDEs have some way of adding plugins to them that suddenly expand the functionality for our editor so that it can work with a completely new programming language, for example. We do not have or we do not want to open and change the source code of the editor itself each time we want to add some new language, for example, or a support for a new versioning tool. Now, the solid principles are a bit advanced thing to have in mind. However, I think that this example fits very well for showing how it can benefit us in one real-life project, so that next time we encounter some similar situation, we can immediately know if this principle fits to our problem and why we should use it, how it can benefit us. And by the way, does this explanation make any sense so far? Would you write me a comment if you think that this could be explained better, and I will address it in more details in the following videos. And also subscribe for the new videos while you are down there. Okay, so let's change this validation class so that it's a bit more open for extension as we discussed. And first we want to get this out of our validation class. And we need a place where we are going to store those plugins or several validation rules at the same time. We're going to make one private property here that will be called, well, rules, because I'm that creative. And we can make this property here an array of rules, but whatever. But I would like to chain adding of these methods because I think it looks nicer. So let's make one method called add rule, which will accept one rule, right? And it will add it to our new array. And we will need one public method also that will actually do the validation once we are finished adding the rules. So it will just get the value that we want to validate against, and then we are just going to loop over all of our rules. So this rules as individual rule, and let's ask our rules to validate our value. Then we are going to check if the rule returned true, or rather if it's a false. This will be the rule validation then. We are going to return false, and if none of the rules returns false, then we are going obviously to return true because everything is fine then. Now inside of our controller, we can, instead of this validation password and username, we are going to check if the validation add rule, and this rule will be the new validate minimum, for example, of 3 characters. And then we could call the validate here, and this validate will work. However, we want more than one rule. Let me just set the session here first, and this will validate the password. But in order to add more rules or to make this method chainable, we need to return something. In our case, it doesn't return anything, but there is one nifty feature. If we would to return this, then this add rule will practically become our validation object. And that way we can add multiple rules, for example, maximum of 20, and we can add another rule again, right? Which will be the new validate special character, right? Now, if I would try our application with any luck, it should work. And of course it doesn't. And that is because I have this validation method, which should be validate actually, because PHP thinks of it as a constructor. And our rule works. It is showing us that the password must be between 3 and 20. And if I would put the password between 3 and 20 and have one special character, and if I would type the email wrong, it will show it. And you can see that it is showing it constantly, even if I've just visited the page. That is because it's been stored in a session. And one easy trick to remove this from the session the moment the error message is being displayed is to unset the actual value right after we've displayed it here. So now if we come to our page, this error will not be permanent. And let's try that again. Now we don't get that error if I write something that is validating the password. let's make this same rule for the username just to see how it would work. And here, instead of special character, the username has to validate the email, right? And then if I submit here, I get the error that the username is not valid. Let me just echo these values here again so that they are preserved. So I'll just put the value to be the value from the post, and the default will be empty. The same for password. Now, if I would to put the correct email here, it doesn't work, and let's see why. That is because I'm using the password here, so this should be username. Let's try again. Now the username is not defined, and it should be, well, it should be username. Oh, it's invalidate email. Here it should be value, right? So now the username is correct, the password is not correct. If I would to unvalidate the username, I would get that the username is not correct. And if I would put both correct, we are basically just coming back to the sign-in page. That's because we don't have our login logic completely implemented, and that is this bad login here. So let's put another error here so that this is else. Validation error should be something like username or password is incorrect. And now we get all the appropriate messages with the validation. We should also check if there are any messages here so that we don't even go and try to do the login if there are some validation errors. So if the messages are actually empty, only then are we going to validate to try the login at all. And this doesn't even need to go into the else now. It can just be displayed here. And that is pretty much it. We have the validation. If the username is not valid, it will complain. If we enter some shorter password, it will complain about that one. If we enter the correct password format, it will basically tell us that the username or password is incorrect. And I hope that you can see how easier this code is now to use and easy to understand and to figure out what is actually going on here. We can just look at this code and easily say that this rule is validating against minimum, maximum, special character. Here the same as the email. As a matter of fact, we might remove the minimum here or the maximum if the email should be longer. We just remove one line and we didn't have to touch our class. We can just remove line here and we can just add a new validation method that it should validate against the database, for example, or to validate the IP or whatever we need. It's very, very easy to extend our validation. Also, our validation class, we can basically now remove this validate username and validate password. So from 200 lines or 100 lines, we are going back to 25. And this is now much easier to understand, to follow, to expand. And also our validation class can now focus on a more general part of validation, like providing the proper messages and proper feedback, rather than having to worry about each and every specific validation rule. We just give it what it needs to use, and it doesn't care what the rules are. So we learned about Open Closed Principle from the solid group of principles and how it can benefit us by using it so that we can have a way easier method to extend the functionality of a class. And this would be now a perfect place for me to introduce the automated testing, but I'm afraid that we will never reach the administration of our project if we do everything right now. So more on automated testing later. But this code here has an obvious problem, and that is that we have to remember to implement this validate method. This one here, for example, validate rule method in each and every of our rules. And if we forget to add it, our code will crash because our validation here depends on this validate rule to be implemented in each of those rules that it's using. And that is something that we need to solve by using interfaces. And in order to keep this video short, this will be your homework. So try to modify this code or your validation so that it uses interfaces. So you will code this class, this validation class, to the interfaces rather than the concrete implementation of our plugins. So your job is to make sure that our plugins are uniform and that they use interfaces and that they all have this validate rule method here. And interfaces are not that difficult to learn. I will explain them in both interfaces and polymorphism in a bit in the next lesson. But try to use them on your own so that you get your feet wet, so that you get familiar with what we are going to talk about. Because in the future lessons we will use interfaces more often, especially when we continue with the active record. So they are a bit important tool to know and to master. And here is a joke for you.